Okay. Hey, hi everybody. This is the serverless security talk. Now it's kind of it'll be like a little bit of an intro to serverless, and what that means for security, some things to consider. So if you're kind of looking for like more advanced type serverless, it's like this may not be as good, but we also have some fun vulnerable serverless app that we can look at in the end. Anyways, who's done serverless, or who feels who's ever like kind of fiddled with it or anything? Experimented, okay, yeah. Mostly Amazon like Lambda, or like are we seeing like OpenWhisk or Azure Functions or anything like that? Is mostly Lambda? Both Lambda and Google. Okay, great. Yeah, great. Yeah, I kind of like the Lambda is kind of the big one, just because everybody's already like an Amazon customer and already like that. And so don't worry, this is not a thinly veiled vendor pitch. It's very thickly veiled. No, it's the company I work for. We don't do serverless. We have some stuff like in the works we're thinking about for things in the future, but really this is where we're looking at like the kind of a larger picture, like what serverless is and how we look at it securely. So I know it's the afternoon, I know the barbecue's sitting in, so if you want the slides right now and you can just sort of like, wander off, you can send me an email, and my email out of office responder will send you the slides directly. And so we should be good, right? And you don't have to say anything in the email like, really funny jokes, or I laughed at everything, I couldn't stop, so if you want to, but okay. So I work over, in my day job, I work over at Signal Sciences, and I do some research and stuff over there for them. We have a booth in the other room, and we can tell you all about it, but we do like RASP, or like next-gen web app firewall that does defense for like APIs, microservices, and web applications. So it's pretty cool. I'm really excited to work there. We're really excited what we're doing. I also do a lot of stuff with DevOps Days here in Austin. One of my main cohorts, Ernest, is over here on the front row. But DevOps Days is a really great conference. So if you're, and I really think our Austin one is like probably the strongest one, or one of the stronger ones out there. And so definitely, if you're in the Austin area or Dallas, San Antonio, Houston areas, like try to make it in for DevOps Days Austin. It's a really great event. I've also, along with Ernest, I've been doing stuff for lynda.com, which is also the same as LinkedIn Learning, and we're the author of this course on DevOps fundamentals. We also have a course on continuous delivery. So if you have and one on infrastructure as code, and we got some security stuff and SRE stuff kind of planned for the spring. But if you already, I just mentioned that because some people already have Lynda access and you don't even know it, just from like your corporate account. So if you want to check it out, you're like, oh, that was the best 40 minutes of my life, and I could just use 8 hours more of hearing James's voice talk to me, then you're in luck. I got a place for you to go. So, and I blog at the Agile Admin and over at my the corporate blog as well. So I'd like to share with you like some conclusions up front, so you know like where we're going with this talk. We're going to get to this definition about how it's using functions as deploy units. We'll read it when we get to it. But that's where we're going to define it. We're going to look at serverless patterns that are emerging. We're going to look at how security is both easier and harder in some sense, and 4 key areas of where you should look at security inside of your serverless infrastructure or your application. And also we have LAMBHACK, which is a very vulnerable Lambda open source project that I've been working on, but and it's kind of fun. We'll play with that as well. Okay, so let's start out here. What is serverless? The first thing I always hear people say is like, but they're still servers, and it's kind of like akin somewhat to like what everybody was saying to the cloud, like back in 2007 or 2008. It's like the cloud. I've been doing the cloud since 1987, or something like that, right? So it's still in that moment where people are trying to figure out like what it is, what it means. So there's a couple of misconceptions out there. First, people think it's just like a rebranding of the cloud, and it's just like a marketing effort, and for us to like have another buzzword to talk about. Sometimes people think that okay, it is no servers. Like, what is this? The dark magic of the internet? Or sometimes folks think it's like delivered as backend as a service. So because I'm using, I don't know, say like DynamoDB or whatever, I'm doing serverless. Also, folks kind of tend to think of it as like platform as a service. So, okay, I'm using Heroku, so now I'm serverless or whatever, right? And kind of the older instantiation of platform as a service. And for that, we'll just use Adrian Cockcroft's quote, which, if you just want to win any like argument in any engineering circles, you just quote Adrian. But he says, if your PaaS can efficiently start instances in 20 milliseconds that run for half a second, then you're welcome to call it serverless. Kind of poking a little bit at like how traditional PaaS, like you still had to do a lot of the offloading of management, and it wasn't quite that fast. But serverless is something quite different. So there's a great article by Mike Roberts on serverless architectures and what it is over on Martin Fowler's blog. It's really good. It's about 20 pages. It came out last year. It's really like worth a read. Check it out. I'd recommend it. Patrick Dubois really had a nice little survey that he did on Twitter a little while back. He asks, what makes serverless different for you? So option A, no worries about servers. Option B, per request billing. Option C, instant parallel capacity. Or option D, functions as a deploy unit. And so I think all of those are aspects of serverless that really are highly valued. Those are the benefits that you get out of it. Having that instant parallel capacity and being able to scale out is really cool. But whenever you start thinking about like no longer am I deploying a server with a bunch of code on it and like an application, instead I'm like decoupling all that stuff and I'm deploying just single functions inside of the cloud or inside of the service, and those things are the things that get run and then compiled together. Like that builds my application together. Serverless came about through, I guess back in 2012. That was the first time that people started using the word serverless. They used it to describe continuous integration services run by third parties. People would sometimes talk about like Travis CI or something like that as like serverless CI or something. Didn't really catch on as like a real name at that point. There's some like mobile aspects to that as well that people were talking about. But in 2014, Amazon launched Lambda, and at the time it sort of got dubbed as a serverless thing. And then in 2015, in July, they released the API gateway. And that's when people started really realizing, oh, like I can do more. Like I remember like when they first released Lambda, and it was like, oh, okay, what do I do with this thing? I like resize image. I don't know if you ever looked at it. It's like the resize images is like their main use case, and I was like, well, that's neat, but it's not 1999 anymore. Like, doesn't that sort of stuff just magically happen? And that was a joke. So that's where they are. That's the quality. I'm just warning you. Just so okay, thank you. But when they released API Gateway, it was like, oh, now I have like a thing that can front all my functions, and now I can kind of like actually put together a whole application without running something else, because you still needed it. Before that, you needed a proxy to kind of handle all that. And later that year, there was a company that released the Serverless Company using Amazon Lambda, and they kind of showed how you could build a whole infrastructure kind of web application doing that. From 2015 onwards, lots of frameworks started forming. So there's like Serverless and Kappa and Zappa and Go Sparta and some other ones we'll talk about later. 2016, Google Cloud Functions came out. Azure Functions were released. In 2016, serverless conferences started. 2017, this year we had one here in Austin, actually one of the main serverless conferences, so it was really exciting. So, but why are people so excited about this? And I think this might be a good mental model to think about why serverless is so powerful and why I'm very bullish on serverless, because if you go on the far left and you look at a traditional stack in your data center, you would have a server, and you would only be consuming so much of the resources just out of like inherent, like usage of your system. And I remember, 10, 15 years ago, it was always like, man, we're only like 10% busy all the time, right? But you didn't want to mess with that because you had spikes come in, and so you had to be able to plan for those spiking events. But more or less, all the time you have all this waste going on there. And then we had this thing called virtual machines that came out, and everybody was very excited about it. And we said, oh, now we're going to take all that extra capacity and we're going to put a bunch more blocks in the same thing. Now we've kind of distributed our waste amongst a bunch of different systems, but it's still there. You're still paying for it. That's still part of your value situation. Now, to be honest, I mean, when it came out though, like that was pretty revolutionary, right? Like it was like let's do this. Now in serverless, you're only paying for the bits that you're actually using, and you're only paying when they're getting invoked. And you're doing it to the 100 millisecond part. So it really changes kind of the business situation that you find yourself in, where you're like, whenever I spike to 30,000 people, I can handle it, and I'm only paying for that spike. I'm not paying for all that unused capacity all the time. I think that people also use it because you have a decomposed microservice architecture. So there's really not a good way to do serverless without doing microservices. So I know microservices strike a chord with most folks. Okay, so what do we say serverless is? How do we sort of mentally build up a model here? I'd say serverless is functions as a service. So it's with those like lambdas and other stuff that we were talking about earlier. I think if we were like back to like 1997, we would have called this, and IBM had invented it, it would be called containers on demand, And that was a joke too, so good. We're good. Man, that's great. All right. Anyways, but that's what's happening under the hood, right? So a container spins up, runs for that short amount of time, executes the code, and then goes away. Serverless is the no management of servers, right? And that's the part that people really recognize and start saying, oh, that's really helpful for me. Like I don't have to think about what patch level I'm at with something or what things are running on it. Like I'm now just running this function and it's running in the cloud, and I don't really think about it or care about the actual management of the servers. And you're able to take your burden of your system, a lot of your system burden, and move it off to another provider like Amazon or Google or whatever. It's full of a lot of services. Like you'll knit a bunch of these things all together to be able to deliver this out. And so I really think I like to think about it as serverless is an opinionated framework for compute and containers. So you kind of follow a certain guidelines, and you say, well, here's my function, and as long as it meets all the requirements, like Amazon will say, sure, I will take that, and I will run it when people ask for it, and we kind of come up with a contract of like how people will ask for it, and then it does the execution and returns everything back. So, I said earlier that I'm really bullish on it. I think it's a really great technology. I think we're going to see a lot of people more and more adopting this, and I see that this is sort of like cloud was to virtualization as serverless will be to containers. And so I'm kind of like, I guess I'm bearish on containers and bullish on serverless, to use some Wall Street words, I guess. But I think that if you kind of rewind the clock to 2005 or 6 or I guess 2004 or 5, everybody had a virtualization strategy inside their company, right? It was like, oh, we're gonna like put in VMware or some other random thing. And then Amazon Cloud came out, and at first people were like, oh, like that's for like naive people that don't have real workloads, like my production workloads. But eventually, like we've all sort of moved to the cloud, and we've shown that like it's actually a really good thing to do. But it was an opinionated way to run virtualized machines, and so containers, same thing, right? If you kind of in your organization or in the cloud, you spin up your Kubernetes, your Docker stuff. You're like, oh, okay, like now I still have that operational burden of like managing and running all that mid-layer junk, which is not. It's cool. It answers some problems that you couldn't do with virtualization, but it doesn't simplify your operational burden. And so an opinionated way to run the containers, being serverless, I think has a real thing. So here's my big statement. It's going to disrupt the container market in 1, maybe 2 years. I don't know. Who knows, right? But you got to have some sort of crazy statement to say. So, well, let's say, what is our serverless definition? This is where we're going to arrive to, or is what I think hopefully we're convinced of. It encourages functions as deploy units coupled with third-party services that allow running end-to-end applications without worrying about system operations. Upsides to this are pretty cool. So right now you get scaling built in without any contracts with Amazon. You can scale to 1,000 wide, I believe, with no problems, and then they can up those limits if you need to go further. You also pay for what you use in 100 millisecond increments. Your serverless system administration is mostly lower. It actually changes what you have to have concern for. And I think it's nice because it short circuits a lot of what are the operational stuff that you used to do, and it brings it closer to development, doing some of the things that we always wanted to do with DevOps originally. And I remember early days, getting in with Chef or Puppet, and there's well, you just took your sysadmins or people that were like that and said, well, go write some Chef code and go do all that. But you never really had that great cross. And so everywhere I've worked, it's always been well, okay, they write the Chef code, developers write the other code, and then it meets in the middle. And it is easier to rationalize even in those frameworks. But I think with Lambda and other stuff like that, it helps. And if we're right about serverless being the future, you could just skip dockering all the things. So that'll be easier for you as well. So okay, it's great, but what are the catches behind this? It's the operation model to the operation burden is the operations team has a new burden to rationalize this serverless model, and it's a lot higher than you might think. This is a very simple serverless architecture, and you could easily put 30 nodes on here as well. But it's represented with all these third-party databases you're calling, and different buckets and queues and other things like that. And so to keep this straight in your head whenever things aren't working, it's what do I do? How do I troubleshoot that, right? So your operations team has to figure that out. I really can't come up with a great, right now I don't think there's a great way to avoid vendor lock-in in serverless stuff. So as you do Amazon, it's Lambda's the gateway drug, and you're well, okay, I got to do some Dynamo now I got to do some API gateway, got to do some S3, got to do some CloudFormation, got to do, but the list goes on and on and on, and you're oh, okay, I've now to take that and move it to Azure, that is not happening, right? It's we'll just start something brand new in Azure, instead of trying to roll it over. I think monitoring is another thing that's a problem. There's a great talk on functions as service measurement fundamentals that you can link to from the bottom there. But here's the kind of a grid that is laid out here by one of the guys from New Relic, and kind of the maturity level right now where he's kind of saying FaaS is I mean, really, you have to get a lot of stuff out of logs, and that's been my experience as well from that. And some of the other metrics and stuff, you get some of it, and I'll show it all how it all works here in a second. Yeah, so you end up having to deal a lot with logging, and they're kind of tough to do. So you're still going to need to spin up an elk stack or Splunk or whatever like that to parse that. Also, you're compiling a bunch of different services together, so your reliability is the whole of all the pieces together, right? So you can't you have to build your system in a way to be able to architect for that. And probably these might be deal killers for you. If you need your app needs a lot of disk space, that's probably not going to work out super well for you in serverless. If you need something that's going to run for a long time, anything longer than 5 minutes in one go, probably not going to be great. Anything that's pretty I/O intensive, not so good. And anything that's super latency sensitive that can't wait up for the cold startup time, and I'll share some more about that here in the little demo. So. What are some serverless use cases that we're seeing that people are doing out there today? So a real simple one, this is an ad stream processor, and this is out of the Martin Fowler article, but it's a little nice visual. So previously, you would have something that would read stuff from a queue and pump it into a database. This is a very good use case to put lambdas or other functions like that in there, because they can zap them out of your queue as fast as they come in. This is the kind of the web example, and we'll show some more of this here as we go. But the client browser comes in, and it's I'm looking on my API, I'm looking for this endpoint, and the gateway says, aha, I know which endpoint you need, and I will shift it over to that Lambda function, and then it returns the right one. So then you're able to start building this stuff together. into full-fledged web applications. So you can serve all your static stuff out of S3, and then you kind of build your dynamic backends in Lambdas from by API gateway, and now you're kind of building this whole thing. Well, and there's been a lot of other stuff done, right? There's CI/CDs. People are building serverless CI/CD with LambCI. There's Auth0, which does some stuff for people that are using serverless. We know it's a real technology because someone's put WordPress in it. I don't know. It's not the best use, but I mean we're doing it, right? People use it to set up scrapers or to do an event ingestion or chatbots or load testing or performance testing and all sorts of other stuff. And so I thought, well, how do I really understand the security ramifications of this? Because we could sort of like talk about it all day, but like let's try to actually build one and see how that looks. So that's what we will do. No Mr. Robot fans, huh? Oh, you're like you should not use his image, his likeness. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. Okay. Fair. Fair. There you go. That's right. Sorry about that. Yeah. All right. So let's try a sample application. So I'm going to walk you through kind of like how I did this, and we'll kind of look at all the different pieces of it. So first up, I was like, well, I got to pick a framework. Now, there's a lot of frameworks out there. Serverless framework is one of the bigger ones. They just took some seed funding, so who knows, like, or I guess an A round, so that we'll see how they do. The other ones are, but it's still like an open source product as well. You can go Apex or Kappa, Zappa. I like Go, so I was like, even though Go is not a supported language inside of serverless, like Lambda as a first-class language, there's a framework for it called Go Sparta. So I decided, hey, let's go for that. Why not do that? And it's pretty cool.
We need another language beyond the support.
The what? Yeah.
Because of course we need another language beyond JavaScript, Python, or Java.
Yeah. Well, yeah, of course we'll Go, right? Well, Amazon says they're going to have like full-fledged Go support sometime soon, as much as Amazon will promise for anything. But I've been waiting. It's like been a year now, so we'll see. Yeah. So I was excited. This is Golang, but Amazon Lambda doesn't support Go natively, but it supports this whole idea that you get to bring your own binary. And so that's how this whole thing functions. Is Sparta wraps your compiled binary, your Go code, down into a binary, and then it wraps it in the node container with like a small Node.js shim that'll just sort of say, hey, when I get a call, like invoke this binary over here, and it gets all knit together that way. Also, the reason why Go Sparta is pretty cool, and a lot of the other frameworks is it handles knitting together all your other services that you need. So, you need an API gateway, and you need your API gateway to connect to this Lambda. You don't want to do any of that stuff by hand. Like that's gonna drive you mad. Same thing with like S3 or all that other stuff. So it's pretty cool. Go Sparta includes these things right now, and I think they may have some additional stuff that I don't have listed here. So check it out. Like I know that it's kind of under constant development, and I was just working on updating that the other day. So. CloudWatch events and logs, it hooks with DynamoDB, Kinesis, S3, SES, SNS, does your API gateway creation, like I mentioned earlier. So first I thought, well, let's build a word cloud generator, make it able to consume third-party APIs for text sources, and then return JSON with counts of words and how much ever it found in the text, and just sort of keep it simple. That was my idea. Just make I didn't even put a UI on it. Just like just drop me like a block of JSON, and we'll call that good. And so I did this with it's basically using Lambda, S3, and API gateway. Those are kind of the three things. I didn't like call into the database stuff, or it does use the CloudFormation templates to get all that stuff set up. So this would be the architecture set up here. So there's the API gateway, Lambda, there's a third-party API, and then there's S3. And then I wrote this handler, so I have an event up top with a bunch of things, and I send off to this let's see where we are. Oh yeah, I have this thing called word weight. So it grabs the text and then it sends it over to word weight. And word weight's a pure Go function that does what you would think it scores everything into this JSON blob. And then I hook it together and I say, well, my Lambda function needs to get hooked over to this event that I just set up because everything's event-based in serverless architectures. And I need this resource called wordy/test. And then I want to make sure that it's set up just to do GET requests and just says OK whenever somebody comes in off of it. Let's see. And then you have to, inside of Sparta, you got to give it some config, right? So you have to tell it, well, here's my Lambda stages and the gateway. I want it to be CORS enabled. Set up some stuff for how gets my keys and things like that for provisioning, and it knows where I want it to go. And then it has this little initiator here that tells us you got to do the actual application, but it also includes the API gateway, and the API gateway includes the Lambda, so it hooks it all together. And then you run this magical command to tell Sparta go provision it. And can you guys see that? It's probably pretty blurry back there. Yeah. I really want you to focus in on this line right here. So try to zoom in. Hey, thanks. Yeah, so basically, it spits this wall of text at you, and you're like, I don't know if that worked or not. And then you wait some time, and then it did. The CloudFormation bits kind of take some time, and they're kind of annoying. Sometimes it'll be 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 7 minutes. And you're like, man, this is forever. But once you have that in place, Go Sparta now has a thing where you can say, just redeploy the app and the Lambda bits, and so that just takes 30 seconds or whatever, and that's a lot more helpful. And don't go through the whole CloudFormation, set everything up pieces. And when I came in here, I was like, okay, I'm going to set up some really great strict IAM policies and roles. And so I started with okay, here's what CloudFormation's allowed to do, and here's some other stuff. But then you'll always hit this point. Well, I hit this point. I gave up and just set very bad IAM policies, and I promised to fix them later. So I gave everything full access, right? I was like, I just need this thing to work, right? Because I started out very altruistically and saying Sparta will tell me all these things that I need to fix, and it did for a while, and then the errors stopped making sense, and I was just like, star, you're good, and so and then it actually did work, right? And so then I got my provisioning working, and I was a lot happier. And then you could see the app inside of the console. And you can see where it gets set up, and it is using that node runtime. And the first, so the first run is, yeah, that's right. Okay, I was like, did I have these labeled right? So my first run was 343 milliseconds. Must have been a good day, because usually I get 500 or 600 milliseconds on that one. And then the second run to the same invocation of the same container. You can't see it probably very well, but it's 84. Oh, I have it up there at the top. 84 milliseconds. So that's that whole keeping instances warm or containers warm. And so Amazon doesn't publish how long that is. There's a talk and there's some theory that it's about 4.5 minutes. People have tried to time that out, and that's what it looks like right now, which kind of would make sense for their overall 5 minutes is overall runtime, and so kind of put it in about the 4.5 minute mark for how long they'll keep stuff warm.
So that's longer than Adrian's estimated time to be serverless.
No, so it spins up in 343 milliseconds, but they'll keep it on deck so the 343 milliseconds was not awesome. It's not horrible. You can totally deliver web apps and with that kind of response rate. But that 84 milliseconds, that sounds really good, right? You're like, oh yeah, sweet, I'm doing great.
That's 64 milliseconds beyond 20.
That's right. And so what you're doing? Well, I mean, I'm calling third-party services and stuff like that. I'm doing extra things. I see what you're saying. Yeah, the 20. Yeah. No, yeah, I'm doing other stuff that's taking time, but now I don't have to. That pre-warm. Whenever your containers and your serverless, your Lambdas are already pre-warmed, now you're able to get a lot more benefit out of this, and you're getting in that lower execution time. So you can also log into the console and see your API gateway, and they show you okay, here's your method, and they have this kind of UI that shows you oh yeah, your Lambda on the back end is what's processing it, and here's where it goes out, and you can add some auth and other type stuff there. and restrictions for like who's able to access it. Let's see, what else is interesting here? Okay, you can also do API gateway execution in the console. So whenever I'm doing it there, that's 437 milliseconds on that request. And then, let's see. And then this is just the same thing, but running through the browser as well. And then I was like, well, okay, cool. Like, I got my stuff back, and I'm getting the stacked rank thing. And what does my Lambda look like in the console for like monitoring, and how do I like keep track of like what's actually going on? And I logged in here, and I was like, oh, sweet. Graphs, and then I was like, oh, big holes. Like, oh, it reminds me back of like back whenever in 2007 or 2008 when I first started using like EC2, and it was like, you know, a horrible monitoring experience. And I was like, well, it's just Amazon, you know, that's just the nature of it, right? And then it clicked, and I was like, oh wait, like there's a hole there because nothing was running. Like there was no data because it's like, so there's a little bit of a mental model you'll still have to like overcome as you're progressing with it. But you can watch all sorts of metrics on it. They're not great, but they're at least something for you to look at. Okay, so my overall experience, some of my thoughts. You know, you need a framework, or you're not going to be very happy with it. Also, IAM is very hard. You know, and why is it that way? I don't know. And then also, hey, wow, I have a fully elastic, fast API running on the internet for basically no cost. Like, that's pretty nifty. Like, and that's like the business driver behind all this. And then I started thinking like, oh, this is really going to be huge. Like, I think people are going to take after this. And so we should question, like, is security as an industry, are like we ready for serverless? I liked Rich Mogul's talk this year at RSA, and he was sort of kind of walking the path of Agile to DevOps to cloud to serverless, and he's just like, you know, the world is changing rapidly under the feet of security, and like in the next 5 years, we're not going to see most of these people that we see on the expo floor here, at least in the same state that they're in now. Yeah, and so that gets us back to thinking about security. And security teams really still work in that mindset where like they want to inhibit as much change as possible. And that's still, you know, for better or worse, that's still where we are kind of as industry. I mean, this book was published this month, and like that's what they're saying, right? And that's still like a common thread here. And I've been thinking through this a little bit too, and like what are some new things that security can do? We're not going to actually go through this grid. I have another talk that goes through this grid, but you know, in the old way, we would embrace secrecy. New way, create feedback loops, or you know, old way, build a wall. You know, and then the new way is like have zero trust networks. Old way, doing certainty testing. New way, adversity testing. So if you're interested in that, or you want to know more on that, like I'd be happy to like send you some info on this. But I think like as an industry, like we need to start adapting to the new ways. Cool. I don't know why my mom put that on the internet, but appreciate it. Okay, so here's what I think are the 4 areas of serverless security, and we're going to blaze through it because I want to get to the vulnerable Lambda application. So Shannon Leitz talks a lot about secure software supply chain. That doesn't really change. It changes some in serverless. You have a surface area reduction, right? The code that you write in the libraries, like that's kind of your surface area now. Now you'll still suck in a lot of dependencies and other stuff like that as you write your app, but at least it's the ones you wanted, and it's not like some old version of Bash or some bad version of OpenSSL, which we've all dealt with over the last couple of years, right? Through like Heartbleed or whatever. But you now like have some surface area expansion. So you give your TLS control to the provider. Your routing is now sent over to the provider. You're consuming a lot of third-party services. You got all that like IAM roles and stuff that you still have to like mentally grab. Which I really liked the talk earlier today, talking about from Mike McCabe, and it was talking about startup security. If you didn't get a chance to watch that, you might be interested in that if you're in that, because I mean, just like everybody's kind of wrestling with these bottom pieces, and like they had some really good ideas on how to get through that. So old way, TLS and SSL stuff. Old way, I don't know, that's probably not super visible, but in the code you could define what you wanted in some stuff, or you put it on your Nginx server or whatever. Like that's some server config. But now it's like, okay, I'm going to upload my cert over here to my API gateway to let them kind of like take that out. Also, old way, like especially in like Go apps, you could have your own routes and you could say, here's all this stuff and here's where I want all those things to go and how I want it to be served up. Routing in the new way kind of looks like this, where I'm like saying, all right, well, I got my resource and I'm going to have it call this function, and I got this other thing called the API gateway, which, you know, something to wrap my brain around. Also, like service and third-party expansion. So you're proliferating like across all these things. And I mentioned it earlier, but it's like this is like a very like small stack of what you could do. But this would kind of be a bare minimum you would need to put together like a web app, like in a kind of a dynamic stuff. There's a really great talk about serverless and like hacking out of serverless applications, and I would totally recommend it. It's called Gone in 60 Seconds. Everything in the talk like hinged on like people not able to set up proper IAM roles and policies, which is like, I mean, I get it, right? It's like. And so when you're not doing those things, you can use Lambdas to like help kind of get inside of infrastructure and do other stuff in there as well. But I would just recommend checking out that talk. So, you know, I mean, you still need to do all those things, like have someone watch your config, make sure that you're, you know, keeping track of that. And like I mentioned, Mike and Brian's talk earlier today, the startup security talk, had a lot of good recommendations for how to do some of that stuff. So, you know, a lot of it's like basic hygiene type things that we've been learning in the cloud. It still totally applies. Now another area I think is like delivery pipeline security. So we've always had this idea like we just want to ship the code out there, but the key to do any of that sort of stuff is like good unit testing. So old way was easier to mock. New way, it's like I got to call this Lambda, and like how am I going to do that? And like it's not as easy to do. Like you can still do all your sub stuff, but everything like wrapping like these third-party services, now you're really looking to do like more integration testing, and unit testing becomes harder. But I'd say it's even more critical now that we're doing it. So you want to make sure you're doing some sort of integration testing. Lambda kind of has this idea of stages, and so you can say I want to do a stage or you know a test environment and a production environment. Have good integration testing and kind of all the other stuff that you would want to do in that. I do like that with this, at least when you're using these frameworks, that like configuration is part of your delivery, and that's a pretty healthy thing. A lot of times we would version control, like our Jenkins box is kind of like sitting somewhere, and we're like, please never crash, right? Because we don't have that stuff. It's like, or we have to restore all from backups, right? We don't version control everything like we should. So you got to have, you know, good pipeline practices. I'm just kind of skip through some of this stuff. There's some security testing tools like BDD Security or Gauntlet. I helped write Gauntlet, but you can run Gauntlet in like a Docker container. And then if you're interested in it, Matt Johansson and I did a talk, I guess about 2 years ago at South by about how to do security testing. And it's like a 2.5 hour thing with like workshops and stuff. So if you want to check that out, I hope that'd be helpful. You're also stuck thinking about data flow. You're kind of thinking like, okay, now I got to do data flow diagrams or threat models, and I showed you that those diagrams earlier. Like everything looks a little bit different, but now everything's moving through your system differently, right? It's not, you don't have that monolithic space. So all the problems that you see with microservices, that also applies to serverless. And you know, ultimately, like we have to realize that the provider is responsible for the underlying infrastructure and services, and you're sort of responsible for using those in a secure manner. Let's see. So I don't know, here's some other data flow security ideas that you can think about that become a problem in serverless, where you're dealing with like denial of service, or what if I could get you to spin up 1,000 Lambdas that all run for 5 minutes and consume all your resources. Yeah, other types of stuff. So it's a bit of work there, but you know, there's things that can happen. Okay, so we'll move down into attack detection, which is the last area. So it kind of begs the question of, with all this, is like what still matters in a serverless application? And you know, hey, bad code is still bad. Like this is LastCon. We're used to application security problems, and so we're still need to be looking for kind of some of that traditional stuff in kind of this context and see how people are doing it. So I saw some half chuckles in the back, so I'm pretty excited about that. Thank you. All right, you're right. But all the old stuff that we have, from the last 15 years is still applicable today. So inspired by all the web goats and other things like that, they're getting worse. I got another one. We'll talk about LAMBHACK. So I think with serverless, there is a false sense of security because it's a new technology. It's like, well, I only wrote this like small bit of code. Like, how bad could it be? And so this project, I was talking about it last, or I guess like last January, February. It was like, what if we had like a web goatee type thing, but for Lambda? And so I think we have this false sense of security, but what if we put and I've heard people tell me this too, like they've said, oh yeah, well I got that API gateway thing, like that protects me, right? Like that's gonna like keep out all the denial of services, keep out all the cross-site scripting, keep out all, or whatever, right? And you're like, no, it does not. So I wanted to still make the point that application security is relevant in a serverless infrastructure. So all it is a vulnerable Lambda with an API gateway stack. And shout out to all the other vulnerable stuff ever. So, okay. LAMBHACK is at this URL. It's open source. The only thing that it has in it right now is arbitrary code execution via query string. And I'm looking for more help. Like we could add a UI to it. We could add cross-site scripting. We could do some other fun stuff. And I got a buddy who's interested in working on it, but if anybody else is, like, I'd be happy to like bring in on the project and try to like help get this going, because it's sort of just like a fun thing that I thought would be kind of neat. So, okay, so people laugh. They're like, that was fun. It's like, yeah, okay, cool. But it's vulnerable, and don't base any of your coding patterns actually off of this. So. Let's see, what is this? It's just the project. So can anybody tell me why this is bad? This is kind of the crux behind the main vulnerabilities in LAMBHACK. Not sanitizing, right? It's just like I'm passing, just like, oh, sweet, you gave me a thing, and I'm just going to pass it over, right? And just sounds good. But with that, we can start doing things like this. Like I could say, well, okay, Lambda, how magical are you? Like what kind of system are you, right? And you can start put it in here, and then you just have to add arguments in here. And you can add Linux commands or Unix commands in there. And I just have a little sleep in there because I was getting some API gateway timeout issues. So here's results from a uname. We can see that it's kind of self-reporting. Kind of this, like, I think this is an Amazon Linux box, but it has a Red Hat ID in there as well, but using their Amazon Linux OS. And you also have some tip space that you can write to. So like that's the interesting thing about Lambdas. Like there's no real good way to like write to disk, but in a lot of ways. But this is like your scratch space here. So I went and checked it out, and then we talked about that whole like. When a request comes in, like Amazon like will keep the containers warm until like another request comes in for like 4.5 minutes. Okay, 2 minutes. All right. So here's the first request. We're just saying, show me the contents of temp, which we saw earlier didn't have anything. And I said, okay, well, why don't you create a file called Wickett file on a completely different request? So if my site was popular, like I could have easily gone to a new Lambda. But because no one was on the site except for me, like I'm just reusing that same Lambda over and over again. And so then I write a Wickett file, and then I wait a little bit, and then I say, okay, tell me what's inside of /temp, and then like there it is. I see my file that was available. I can also see what's on the box, okay, curl's available to me. So I can make like a poor man's proxy here and start calling. So here I'm saying curl to example.com, And then here's the contents in the payload of example.com kind of proxied through my Lambda. Yeah, I was getting some like API gateway timeouts, so I was like trying to like just troubleshoot that, and I just added those in. I think we could probably knock those out with a little bit of extra thinking. I think yeah, I don't know. So, and sometimes I would get like weird errors, and if I add the sleep, the errors just kind of like magically went away. And I was like, well, fair enough. We'll sleep for a second. So, yeah. So we need help on this. Like we can put together cross-site scripting and other attacks, add other auth vectors. We really need a UI, and so if you're interested, hit me up. Okay, I think that's. I think that we've kind of have some closing thoughts here, like application security. Like Lambda provides you a limited blast radius now, but it's not exactly zero. Monitoring and logging plays a key role. So things you can do is like detect longer runtimes for Lambdas over time and kind of keep an eye on it. Look at other error rate and occurrences of things if people are trying to like do malicious things against you. Look at data ingestion and how big stuff is when they're coming in, and making sure you're logging all the actions from Lambda and then sucking those back into like some sort of elk stack or wherever, so you can parse through that. And it's cool. So application security is still relevant. You can still do a lot of the same things. They're going to look a little bit different in Lambda, but they're still very similar. And like a lot of Lambdas like ingest files, right? So like, upload a thing and it stores over to S3. Well, like what if you started appending stuff that would like later could like show up in a web page or other things like that? There's some ideas of things that people are doing or trying to do. I think that's it. Let's see. We'll say the defensive stuff, like we talked about logging, metrics. There is a SQLi wrapper thing called Vandium, which is out there. You need to set your CSP stuff. I think good API gateways are a good place to add defense. And that I would recommend like starting there with instrumentation. At Signal Sciences, we're looking at some of that with some API gateway providers, because we're thinking like that's a good spot to provide defense there. But really, a lot more needs to be done in this space, and I think OWASP and folks in this room and other folks in our community, are going to see a lot more serverless come out, and so like hopefully this could be helpful. All right, so I think we're going to see actually more of a rise in application security, because this takes away some of the OS level stuff, the network level stuff, and it actually puts it more back squarely into application stuff, where plenty of people like take a parameter and then like pass it in unfiltered to it's like the next step, right? And like we know that, we've been doing that for years, but now like the rest of the world is kind of like going to be seeing that as well. All right, so I think that's it. We're done. I think we arrived at our conclusions. So yeah, thanks.